ignorance of the law is no excuse. However, if you're a small business, we do take into consideration any any reasons for which you may have had some claimed ignorance of a rule or requirements from which a variance is sought. We'll also look at your financial and other capabilities to comply. Next slide, please. The third is where we start, the third finding is where we look at the impact to the environment, impact to nearby residents, people, and health. So we're looking at, it's kind of a weighing and balancing. If the taking, which we talked about, which is the harm to the facility, is without a corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants. So we're going to look at excess emissions. We're going to look at what type of emissions they are. Are they toxic? How close are people? And what is the amount? And we're going to do a weighing and balancing. The fourth finding is whether curtailment was considered in lieu of a variance. Variance is last resort. So if you could have reduced your throughput and not have to come and ask for a variance, we would rather see that. So we could not make that finding. Next slide, please. The fifth finding is excess emissions are reduced to the maximum extent possible or feasible. And so we're going to be looking at mitigation that's been proposed, whether there's additional mitigation that could be imposed, and we're going to impose that through conditions of the variance. And finally, there needs to be monitoring of any excess emissions. Next slide, please. So that's variances in a nutshell. Orders for abatement, next slide, is the other type of case we hear very often. This is where a company either will not or cannot comply with rules, or an entity, but cannot qualify for a variance. And usually it's because we cannot make the finding of beyond reasonable control. So I call this the flip side of a variance. In this kind of a matter, in order for abatement, the district is always the petitioner, and the district has the burden of proof. Orders for abatement will either order a facility to shut down immediately, or more often, comply with prescribed conditions that we put into the order, which are designed to reach rule compliance as quickly as possible. Next slide. An order for abatement has the same effect as any enforceable rule or regulation. NOVs can be issued, and an order for abatement is not a variance. Again, the source is not exempt from continuing penalties. Next slide. Very quickly, there are two types of orders for abatement. The first type, contested, is very rare, and that's essentially where the facility denies a violation and the board is tasked with getting evidence of and finding a violation, as well as good cause to issue an order with prescribed conditions and ways to get them into compliance. And then the second, which is what we hear more often, is what's called a stipulated order for abatement, where the facility and the district agree to the factual findings and conditions of the order, and the facility does not need to admit a violation. Next slide, please. And finally, the last type of hearing that we will have is the rarest, which are appeals. So there are several types of appeals which are set forth and we get jurisdiction from the Health and Safety Code. The first is if you are a facility and you receive a permit and you're not happy with a condition, you may appeal that condition. The second type is if you are a facility and you have been denied a permit altogether, you may appeal that denial. Or you may be a third party and a permit was granted to a facility and you have an opportunity to appeal that. So we've heard third-party appeals from schools where a permit was given to a facility that is really close to that school and impacts that school. We've also heard third-party appeals from, for example, competitors, where a facility was given a permit and the competitor feels it wasn't properly granted. And the third type is refusal of ERCs, and we've had, I think, one of those in my tenure on the board. I've been on the board for 11 years. And finally, I just wanted to point out that the standard of review on an appeal is very deferential to the executive officer. It's a very high standard of review, and the burden of proof is on the petitioning party. And the question is, did the executive officer act properly in making the decision? So essentially just acted as he or she would normally act in either granting, denying, or whatever type of action he or she took. And that's basically the overview. And the next slide is if anyone has any questions, because that was a very truncated version of, of this presentation. So I don't know if anything was left out.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great presentation and a lot there. And boy, I wish I had that presentation when I first got on the board. That's the type of presentation that fills in a lot of blanks. And you know, I'm glad we record these meetings and put them out to YouTube. And I'm going to also encourage my fellow board colleagues as they come onto the board or new board members, they should hear that presentation. So thank you very much. Now we do have quite a few questions coming up from our committee here. So first up, I see Bill Lamar, followed by David, and then Todd. Bill, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question, more of a clarification. In several of your slides, particularly number 17, you were talking about the taking of a business or practical closing of a business. And my recollection of a taking is when a government encroaches or occupies someone's land or business, or occupies real property, and yet you say practical closing of a business. So what is your definition of a taking?
Sure, it's a really good question. And again, I tried to put this presentation together so that I could get through it quickly within the time frame that was given. So that is not exactly how the Health and Safety Code defines it. It says there's two different possibilities. Number one is an unreasonable taking of property. So that means we define that as lost profits. We define that as, for example, if there are no excess emissions, and let me give you an example. A piece of equipment is broken down. And so the variance is only from having to do a source test or some other kinds of test, and they can't do it. And so they need a variance. But there are no excess emissions. But for every day that they are out of violation, they are subject to penalties from the district. That also could be a taking. Or it could just be that something's out of order, some piece of equipment, and they need to bring it back online. And to do that, they need a variance. And if we deny the variance, the taking is of that equipment or of, again, lost profits. So that's how we define that. And then separately is an essential closing of a lawful business. That's, you know, if we denied the variance and as a result, there is just simply no variance, there is no business left, that would be a closing of a business. I hope that explains it better.
Is that definition that you just articulated shown anywhere in any of the district's documents or hearing board documents? Because it's kind of complex, and as I say, I'm sure that I'm not the only one that would have a problem with my understanding of a taking or the customary definition of a taking.
Let me find, oh, here it is. Okay. I'm going to read to you exactly what it says. This is that, I have my printout that I use for my hearing. So this is the Health and Safety Code. It's 42351, I believe, is the findings we need to make for a variance. And that finding, which is finding number 2, is exactly, I'm going to read it word for word. That due to conditions beyond the reasonable control of the petitioner, requiring compliance would result in either A, an arbitrary or unreasonable taking of property, or B, the practical closing and elimination of a lawful business. Then it goes on to say, in making those findings where the petitioner is a public agency, and that's where I talked about the essential public service, and we're talking about, in that case, it's defining a taking or a practical closing, but whatever that is, it's defining it as imposing an unreasonable burden on an essential public service. And we're talking about schools and prisons and landfills and sewage treatment, water delivery, those kinds of things. So that's where it is defined. And from there, like a court of law, we interpret it.
You said Health and Safety Code 42351?
Yeah, I'm hoping I'm getting it right. I'm pretty sure it's 42351. If not, it's 42352, but unfortunately I don't. But 42351, I believe it is.
All right. Thank you very much.
Of course. There were other questions?
Yeah, David Rothbard, go ahead, David.
Yes, thank you. Well, I want to thank you for that presentation. It was very helpful. I don't think I've ever seen a presentation on the hearing board, so I think a lot of people find that useful. So thank you very much for the presentation. Question, actually wanted to get your feedback on maybe recommendations for a hypothetical situation. I represent essential public services, wastewater treatment plants specifically, and there's a lot of angst about public safety power shutoffs where you need to run your generator because the power is being shut off. And we have certain limits on those generators. And we get concerned if we go over the 200 hours we have in our permit, we'll need relief. Hypothetically, if that happens to 50 facilities, we don't want everyone going in and asking for a variance all at once. You get overloaded at the hearing board. My question is, what would the process be, or what would you recommend for a group variance or a group stipulated order? Is there anything that might be helpful for both sides?
Sure, there is always the group variance, and when you do that, you would file a single petition. But that, and it's very specific. So if you go to our hearing board rules and regulations, which you can always find. So if you go to the AQMD website under the About tab and you find the hearing board, once you go onto the hearing board tab, then we have, sub-tabs or whatever you call them. And there's one with all of the relevant rules. And in there, you can find our rules and procedures. And there's a lot of specifications. You need to get declarations from each of the entities that want to join. And it really has to make sense for it to be a group variance, meaning all of the relevant facts that we would look at for the 6 findings really have to have them all in common. And when you're talking about something so fact specific as the use of individual generators, I don't think a group variance is going to be the best bet, because every single entity or agency that you're talking about is going to have had different reasons why it used its generator at different times during the year, and why each of them are going over their 200-hour limit. I would just suggest that when it happens, that you do apply for, well, if it's very close to going over 200, you'd have to go for an emergency. But to the greatest extent possible, try to anticipate that and go for, you'd have to go for a regular variance, probably, because it would be more than 90 days. And those we can take pretty quickly, but there would have to be real reasons for it that are beyond your usual usage. Like, we've had many of those due to fire. So some of the remote, and a lot of them are also public uses. So if we've seen like remote antennas or whatever you would call them, where 911 relies on them, but they're so remote that power has been cut off because of a fire, and the generators are certainly going to go over. So we would have to individually weigh and balance all of those, because, as you say, it's not the overrunning of the hearing board, but we don't want lots of generators overwhelming all of the gains that have been made by the district. So we take it very seriously to really balance each one and make sure each one is meritorious.
Maybe as a different mechanism, would a stipulated order for abatement be better if the air district staff would agree with something? Would that be a little better mechanism for that type of situation?
You would want to be careful of that, because orders for abatement are punitive. So they're not to be taken lightly. I understand that there are ramifications of being under an order for abatement that go beyond the hearing board, but I don't know exactly what they are and whether, if they're stipulated, if those ramifications occur. But there are penalties involved, and certainly there's some stigma, I think, if you're under order for abatement. So if it's beyond the reasonable control of an entity to go over the 200 hours, absolutely you should apply for a variance.
Understood. Thank you.
Of course.
Derek, I see your hand up, but also Todd Campbell. Go ahead, Derek.
Just real quick to address David Rothbart's concerns. There was a couple bills that were introduced in Sacramento, backup generator bills, that they didn't make it out of the houses of origin, or failed to get out of any house. And so, but we were in discussion with many of the, for instance, the water companies, the municipal utility, California Municipal Utilities Association, hospitals, on their backup generator bills. And what I'd like to do, David, is we could talk about at a different time, and we can have staff give you a call, but talk to you about the negotiations that we did with them.
And I'm actually, so you don't have to spend too much time. I'm aware of exactly what you're talking about. So I appreciate that, Derek, and we can always talk offline. I just was curious about the scenario, what the hearing board can or cannot do.
Thank you for that. Mr. Todd Campbell.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.
It's nice to see you too. I was going to say, I've known Julie probably for 19, 20 years. And it's great to see you. You haven't aged a day. I don't know how you do it. But as you can see, Julie is incredibly competent, articulate. She knows her stuff, and we're very lucky to have her for 11 more years, 11 years. And I hope we get her for another 11 more if she's willing. But I'm very proud of the fact that she's, leading the group, and it's very clear to me that we're in very good hands. Thank you for your dedication and all that you do. And it's too bad this, with COVID, that I can't see you in person, because it would be great to chat more. But thank you for everything.
Thank you. I would have liked that too.
Was there a question in there, Todd?
Yeah, it was, how did she look the same after 20 years?
Good luck.
All right. Any other comments or questions on this item? If not, again, Julie, thank you. Great presentation. And like I said, this is one of the parts of the board that I have to spend a lot of time explaining to people that, are not quite as familiar with the Air District as a lot of other people are that are in business, but it's a very important part of the board, and I appreciate all your hard work there, and keep it up. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me for that reason.
Thanks. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and go on to the next item. Discussion on the overview of Rule 1407. And who's going to be presenting this? Yusin Wu? Win-win, sorry.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Win-Win Vo. I'm a program supervisor in planning and rules, and today I'll be providing a quick summary of Rule 1407. Next slide, please. So Rule 1407 is one of our industry-specific air toxic rules. Rule 1407 regulates 3 carcinogens: arsenic, cadmium, and nickel, from non-ferrous metal melting. Non-ferrous metals include metals such as aluminum, copper, brass, and bronze, and are melted in furnaces, as you see here. Once they're melted, then they get poured into molds and cast into products or different shapes and ingots. Next slide, please, Paul. So this process does have the potential to emit toxic air contaminants and are addressed by point source controls, housekeeping, and enclosures. Point source controls reduce emissions at the source, the furnace itself. Housekeeping and cleaning will minimize the amount of fugitive dust that can become airborne. And then lastly, we have enclosures, which minimize the potential for these fugitives to leave the building enclosure itself. Next slide, Paul. So here's a general overview of the structure of Rule 1407, and now I'll go into detail for each of these sections. Next slide. The first provisions are for our point source control requirements. There are 3 emission limits in Rule 1407, 1 each for arsenic, cadmium, and nickel. And then each toxic air contaminant does have the option of 2 emission limits. You can either use the control efficiency that is calculated per furnace, or you can meet what we're calling the aggregate mass emission limit for each contaminant, which is the mass emission limit of all the furnaces that are melting non-chromium metals at a facility. Having these two options allows the facility to regulate as they please. For example, if you have one large furnace with a lot of emissions, you can put controls on that, and then you can leave your other furnaces uncontrolled. And then additionally, for a third option, facilities do have the option to opt out of these emission limits if their health risk assessment or air toxics inventory reports show that below certain thresholds. Next slide, please. So controlling fugitive emissions is a really important aspect of this rule and many of our other toxic rules. During the rule development for Rule 1420.1 for lead acid battery facilities, staff found that fugitive emissions actually significantly elevate ambient levels at our monitors. So in order to deal with these fugitive emissions, Rule 1407 has a comprehensive building enclosure and housekeeping measures. For the building enclosure requirements, it's required that all metal melting operations, melting, casting, grinding, cutting, occurs within a building. So what we consider a building enclosure is having to minimize your cross stress. There cannot be two openings that are opposite sides of each other. So the rule requires that at least one of these openings is closed. And they can be closed by things such as strip curtains, roll-up doors, or even other large equipment that can be used as barriers to block the flow from one end of the building to the other. And then as for housekeeping measures, the first set of housekeeping measures has to do with storing material that has the potential to create fugitive dust, either in enclosed storage areas, in the building enclosure, or in closed containers. And then as for the cleaning requirements and housekeeping measures, there's certain periodic provisions that are you required to clean using an approved cleaning method, such as using a HEPA vacuum or wet cleaning methods of specific areas. Those specific areas are the actual cutting, melting, grinding areas themselves, entryways of building enclosures, or places where accidents have happened. For both the building enclosure requirements and housekeeping measures, the rule does allow for alternative measures as long as they're approved in a compliance plan. Next slide, please.
Before you continue, you know what? I don't know if it's just me or others, but you're coming up broken up a lot. So maybe that you're taking a lot of bandwidth. You want to close your video, stop your video, and see if that works, because sometimes that does work. I'll let you know if it helps out.
Thanks, Derek. She was coming
I
across
was getting
the
the
top.
same thing. So thank you. Yes, I thought it was me, maybe.
Go ahead, Win-Win.
All right, thanks, Derek. So Rule 1407 has several testing and monitoring requirements. The first is periodic source testing every 60 months. This ensures that the emission limits in the rule are being met, and if a facility has control devices, that their collection efficiency limits are also being met. In between source testing, there are continuous and more frequent monitoring, which ensures that the equipment is being operated and maintained properly. It is also a good indicator for facilities that their equipment is not working, and they get notified of it almost immediately. And then lastly, there's material testing, which requires testing of the raw materials for arsenic, cadmium, nickel to ensure that these contaminants are within the limits of the rule. Next slide, please. The last section of the rule is exemptions. The last amendment we did in 2019, we made these exemptions more stringent. As they were previously written, they were very broad and allowed a lot of facilities to opt to be exempt from the emission limits. So the first exemption that we revised was we're phasing out what is called the clean aluminum scrap exemption. This allowed for facilities that utilize clean aluminum scrap to be exempt from the emission limits, but the provision didn't require any sort of concentration limits for arsenic, cadmium, or nickel. So it didn't help protect the community since we weren't looking at the arsenic, cadmium, nickel concentrations. So as of January 1st, 2021, this exemption will be removed. And then for the metal or alloy purity exemption, it originally only had a limit for arsenic and cadmium, but didn't have a throughput limit. So the amendment included a throughput limit of 8,400 tons per year. And this makes it so that those large facilities, even though they're melting alloys with very low concentrations of arsenic and cadmium, with a high throughput, they may be potentially exposing the surrounding communities. So we put, in addition to the arsenic and cadmium limit, a throughput limit on it. Next slide, please. So that concludes my presentation, and I'm available to answer any questions.
Thanks, Win-Win. That did help when you turned off your video, because I guess you were using too much bandwidth.
It did help. Good recommendation. Thank you, Derek.
Thanks, Derek.
Rita, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. I just had a clarifying question. How many facilities are you looking at that are going to be impacted by this rule? And then what types of facilities are they? Like, what are they manufacturing?
So there are about 60 facilities that are impacted by this rule, although a majority of them would fall under one of our exemptions and really only have to do housekeeping, record keeping, and the building enclosures. And then, I'm sorry, Rita, what was the second part of your question?
What types of facilities, like what kind of manufacturing, what kind of product are they putting out?
From what we've seen, they range from everything from, pure ingots that other facilities are using, some art and sculpture type pieces. And then we've also seen, parts for manufacturing of different industries. I think oil and well industry is one that we see often, aerospace sometimes.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rita.
Any other questions, anyone? Not seeing any. All right. Thank you very much. It was a great presentation and a good update. All right. With that, we're on to our written reports that are attached. Does anyone have any questions on the written reports? Everyone must be ready to go get lunch since we don't have lunch waiting for us. All right. We have any other business from the members of the board? I see Bill Amar, you got your hand raised. Bill?
Yeah, thank you. I had been reserving this. I guess I have a request more than anything else, and I had been reserving it to raise at the Home Rule Advisory Group, but it seems like the district has abandoned Home Rule. We haven't met for, I guess, over a year now. Whether they've lost interest in it or not. But anyway, my request, since we had such an excellent presentation about the hearing board, I would like to suggest that we have a similar presentation on CAPCOA. I would venture to say that majority of this committee or this advisory group's members don't even know what CAPCOA is, what they do, who they are, much less that Wayne is the current president. But I think it's particularly timely since the ARB has several regulations coming out here in the next few months dealing with much of what Win-Win was just talking about, toxic air contaminants, maybe 1,000 of them. And it's going to affect all 35 air districts, particularly South Coast. So I think it would be, certainly my suggestion, if we could have either their executive director or someone else give us a better understanding of not only their involvement in these two issues, but what they do as an association and how it affects rulemaking in California and in the South Coast District.
Derek, I see your hand raised and I see a lot of heads nodding. So what can you tell us, Derek?
So just real quickly, CAPCOA is an umbrella group of all the air pollution control officers in the state, but it stands for the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association. Let us talk to Tung Lee, who heads up. He's executive director for CAPCOA, and either that or Wayne will give the presentation. But let us check first.
Derek, just as FYI, I was just talking to Tung yesterday about the issue that Bill's talking about. So Tung's aware of it, and Tracy Goss is involved as well. So both of those individuals might be helpful.
Yeah, well, just like at any organization, you go to the president first, and then you go to the executive officer. So I'm going to check with our executive officer, Wayne, who's the president of CAPCO right now, and just see how he wants to handle it.
Very good. All right, Rita, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to support Bill. I am familiar somewhat with CAPCOA, but I would really be interested to hear what specific issues they are working on. And I guess, you know, in principle, it's kind of concerning where regulatory agencies are sort of, for lack of better words, pushing a certain regulatory agenda. And so, yes, it would be very interesting to hear about what CAPCOA's positions are. Thank you.
Very good. Unless there's something else, that brings us to the public comment period. Do we have any public comments for members of the public? For items not on the agenda? Not seeing any hands raised on the attendee side. All right, with that, what brings us to the end of our meeting. Our next meeting will be Friday, October 9th at 11:30. Thank you all for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.